Okay, I think we're going to move to the panel. So we're going to do like we did last time, in that each of the panelists get 1 minute to sort of sum up their thoughts on the other panelists, and from there we can open up the discussion to the floor. I had one thing that I'd like Paula to talk a bit more about. So we've seen the U.S. contribute to defeating the defamation of religion resolutions, and we've moved on to sort of the paradigm of Resolution 1618. But it seems to me that the position of the OIC states is very much the same, in that it's the same things that they want to prohibit. They just, instead of describing this defamation of religion, which has no basis in international law, they just move into Article 20 ICCPR and saying, okay, it falls under hate speech laws, which is a bit problematic for European states, not for the US because of the First Amendment, but because all European states have hate speech laws on their books, and we see that these hate speech laws in different countries are being enforced relatively strictly. You need only go to France, and there the Minister of Interior can decree that a comedian, however anti-Semitic his humor, can be ordered not to perform, something that would not be able to take place in Denmark, and which is relatively draconian. So is that a real success? Is it a victory, or is it just papering over the cracks? That's something that we can perhaps also touch upon in this panel. But I'm going to set you off, Krista, with 1 minute, and the others will follow.
Thank you. I will start with my reference to professors again. As you know, wherever we have 2 professors, we have at least 3 different opinions. It's said by a German professor, by the way. Now, there's so many thoughts being tossed around. I think there's a general consensus here. I mean, there's no sharp differences amongst us in the panel. And I will touch upon 2 things. I think the notion of how we should activate ourselves, by us, I mean those who deem ourselves to be in the good side of things. I think it was sad that an old notion, which was first brought about, I think, by the then Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, never got any further. The idea in the UN to create a democratic caucus. It was met with approval bipartisanly in the States, because I think John McCain at the time, Senator, in his unsuccessful bid for the presidency, made that part of his foreign policy platform. And I think that's a good thing. Why is that a good thing? Well, UN is as it is. We need to talk to the bad guys, as we heard the Danish ambassador say this morning. We need to be inclusive. But on the other hand, we also need to get away from this consensual equality of state, UN Noya, meaning that every state is equal. And I liked Rose's reference to proportionality and even-handedness in that. I'm not so sure about your linkage, and that goes to the question of sanctions. In some cases, obviously, it would work. And I think big donor countries like the Nordic countries, for instance, would be well advised, I think, actually, to do some linkage. And this also touches upon the notion of activism of the good guys. I think, yes, indeed, the profile should be increased by some of our northern countries within the EU. We could push the EU maybe to be more active. And if not, let's go on a unilateral basis. But however, that is problematic domestically, and I could sense, I've been around long enough to be able to detect a pattern here. If you're center-left, at least in my part of the world, you would be pro-UN and not so pro-EU. If you're center-right, you're the opposite. You're pro-EU and not so pro-UN. But of course, everybody pays a lip service to the fact that UN. So if pushed, if someone says, are we going to be nasty now to our fellow members in the UN? Domestically, it depends on where you are in the political election cycle in that specific country. And these are realities that I think we need to be aware of. Finally, I liked Michael's description of the Strasbourg court and how it has evolved over time. It's fascinating. If I understood you correctly, you're saying now we have an overgoing docket and we have more civil servant type of judges who are out of tune with a lot of things. Well, that raises the issues of influence from external sources to the bodies, be they the courts or the treaties bodies themselves. I can finish by saying that I was surprised when I came to the Human Rights Committee to find it less politicized than I had imagined. I made a reference to the fact that some of my friends would like to tweak the good countries now and then. But by and large, it's an expert body. It's not as politicized. And that, I think, gives me hope for the future, as long as you can focus on the real things and not get distracted by this very polite UN approach that everybody should be treated and considered to be the same, which they aren't. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree that there isn't that much difference between what any of us are saying. I think we're all looking at composition of bodies and talking about how that composition impacts upon human rights and what we can do with those bodies in terms of, as you said, the internal and external, because the internal deficiencies necessarily map onto the external deficiencies. And I think in many ways that's become quite thematic throughout today, is that we know we have to work with what we've got. There isn't the money and there isn't the political will to go and reform the whole system. So it's about how can we work with it, and that's why I particularly enjoyed what you were saying in terms of what the US is actually doing. What are the practical strategies on the ground?
Well, to lighten things up a little bit, I must then disagree with some of these guys here on the panel, and let me pick you. So we get this more philosophical lecture here, how it does not cohere, and you know, many years ago I gave up on moral philosophy and turned to empirical science. And that gives one little advantage, and very simply, it will also show that the critique doesn't stand the test of history, because all human rights have been progressively realized. You cannot mention a single human right that's not been progressively realized. It's completely ignoring history. So as it's clear from you, whenever you get the first sort of movements towards it, through the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and into the 20th century, there's a long process of articulating these things, and as part of that, there's also a long process of conflicting interest and rights. Human rights in the 20th century is where it becomes most clear that the big dilemma of particularly Europe, and therefore also the rest of the world in the 20th century, is obviously between liberalism and socialism. And human rights is not elevated beyond that. Most of the conflicts of human rights in the 20th century are deeply intertwined with that. The end of the Soviet Empire did not end that story. And therefore, this progressive changing phase of human rights will always, by sociological definition, be part of human rights, because I think the problem with the philosophical rationalization of human rights is that it overlooks one fundamental thing. Human rights is not just unleashed by intellectuals, be it law professors, lawyers, whoever have you. No. It's actually wrong reading. The way human rights were unleashed was by the construction of modern society. So without modern society, as we understand it since Enlightenment, we would simply not have human rights. And the fundamental problem that you then face when you go into these bodies is that you are in effect trying to export modernity via human rights. Nothing could be more naive, practically thinking, because why on earth should you be able to modernize via a few little rights, even if there are 1,000 of them today, according to Jacob? It's pretty much paying lip service to the construction of society. So therefore there will be this fundamental clash. But it also means there will be a fundamental process of realizing these things, and strategically speaking, it's a question about where you step in that process. And that's where you have to make the hard choices. Are you going to tell the truth? Are you going to play around the beat around the bush as a good diplomat? Are you going to issue sanctions, say enough is enough? It's very easy for a country like Denmark. We can just withdraw our development aid. We can do that if we want to. We have influenced EU development sufficiently that you can do something similar to a large extent. So, but the question is the will to do that, where it's the right tool at the right moment. So to wrap it up, human rights in themselves can never solve the problem of modern society. They can only illustrate where the problems are.
Yeah,
I think we're using progressive realization in a different sense. You're using it in an empirical, sociological sense, with which I couldn't disagree. Obviously, in the history of humankind, liberty has been a progressive realization. I don't think anyone could seriously dispute with that. That, you know, there are, even in the freest Western countries today, there was less freedom 50 or 60 years ago. That is obvious. But what is different is this progressive realization is a legal principle in these treaties. Which constitution protected fundamental human rights subject to progressive realization? None. None that I'm aware of. There may be some modern ones. But the classical idea of rights is that you have these rights, and then the Bill of Rights doesn't say, and the state will give you free speech progressively. No, you have free, the Constitution says you're entitled to free speech. And the state has to do it. Now, our conceptions of free speech will change and evolve, and there will be, of course, a process of historical change, and that is normal. But to have a legal text that says you have this right and we'll respect, but we will respect it progressively, that is the dangerous difference. But of course, you know, there is progressive realization as an empirical matter. I mean, I couldn't possibly disagree with that. Yeah. The second point that I wanted to, well, that was going to be my first point, but now I've made that point first. The point that I wanted to make actually in response to well, actually the other three papers, I think we do need to find a way of ring fencing this idea of human rights from this diplomatic and political practice. Because, you know, we've thrown the idea in this big arena, and even in its inception, in the international arena, we had to make some compromises. And I think Spark was entirely right. This is not a good convention when it comes to the European Convention. It really was right, because, you know, these are written out by diplomats, and they're subject to all sorts of compromises. But we must find a way, and perhaps an organization of democracies, one, a liberty partnership, some way of ring fencing, even in the international arena, a certain idea of human rights from this diplomatic practice that is a bit too inclusive, I think, and risks diluting and undermining the idea for the reasons that we've seen.
Paula?
Thanks. So as a wrap-up, I just wanted to make a couple of points. One, which I think is a critically important point, in addressing human rights, the multilateral sphere, the UN human rights machinery, the regional human rights machinery, those are tools in a toolbox that can and should be used, but they are not, I think, the exclusive tools for promoting rights. And states have a lot of other possibilities to do that, including, of course, all of their diplomatic relations, their trade, their aid programs, their training, their assistance, and yes, sanctions. I mean, sanctions is certainly one element of that. It is one tool that should be evaluated whether it will be effective in a particular context or not, and it should be employed only when that question is answered. But I think it should definitely be one of those tools. Quickly on the cooperation of democracies. We are victims of the fact that we are democracies. We engage in consultative processes. We genuinely engage with one another and try to come up with a common position. Autocracies don't have that disadvantage. You look at the treaty reform process that's going on in New York right now. There's the cross-regional group that's led by Russia. It's Russia, okay? It's got a couple of other countries, but Russia entirely has decided what this group is going to put forward together with China, and they are pushing that agenda. They don't sit down and have meetings with all of the other states who are part of that group. They have written up what their agenda is going to be, and they can push forward through it. The rest of us have to sit down and figure out, you know, what we're willing to do, and are you going to be on the board with that, and are we going to... Even within my government, the conversations about what the heck we want to do are enormously time-consuming. So that is, you know, that is the reality. That's the limitation. And getting democracies to work better together is just, it's just harder. It is, and we have to, it's political will. It's putting that effort and that will in. I don't like, and I was a big, in my Freedom House days, we did a lot of work trying to support the community of democracies. And this idea of getting the democracies to do more, particularly at the multilateral fora, and to stand together frankly, to be more of an effective counterbalance, not a replacement, but a counterbalance to the other blocs that we saw that operated so effectively in the UN system. Largely for the reasons I just discussed, I think that has not been as successful as many of us hope, because of course all of the democracies have all of their different considerations, and they want to bring other countries into the club that are not democracies, but they have important relations with them, and so they should be part of the club, and then lo and behold, you can't agree on anything because that country doesn't fundamentally share your view on some of these issues. So it's a hard thing to do. I like the idea. I've yet to see it implemented in a really effective way. Very quickly on defamation in 1618. Most of the countries who were solidly behind the defamation of religions resolutions, as you know, have domestic blasphemy laws. Do they really believe that those laws work? I don't know. None of those countries have a very good on-the-ground situation in regards to religious tolerance, and that's what we always say to them. Hey guys, how's that working for you, at home? It doesn't seem to be working very well. Why on earth are you trying to bring this to the UN level and ask all countries to sign on to this? Largely they do it because of domestic political pressure. So it's an easy way for them to say that A, they're countering the West, B, they are supporting large segments of their population who don't believe in freedom of expression and think it's perfectly fine to ban certain levels of speech regardless of whether that is effective or not in combating religious intolerance, because for many of them that's not their real goal. However, religious intolerance is a real problem, and there are ways that you can address it without restricting the fundamental freedom of expression. And in fact, we would say by repressing freedom of expression, you increase religious intolerance because you don't have that outlet for moderate, middle-of-the-road people to engage in a discussion, and therefore it forces the discussion only to the most kind of radical elements. So what 1618 did, it didn't eliminate the blasphemy laws in many of these countries. We're very disappointed that many of the countries who put forward the resolution have done very little in terms of actually implementing those practical measures on the ground. Some of those countries are moving forward with new blasphemy laws that didn't even have them before, but the success was that it took it out of the normative framework and said, we don't think as the international community that this is the solution for combating religious intolerance. So much more progress to be made in implementation, but at least it set a firm message that the entire international community does not agree that banning speech is the right way to address religious intolerance. And the only speech restrictions that are listed in 1618 are the speech that incites imminent violence, which is the American standard, which of course sets a much higher bar than the European standard. And that's another reason that 1618 was positive. So.
Okay, we've had a very long day, so I can understand if some of you are getting tired, but there have certainly been thought-provoking themes here and speeches, so if you do have questions, please raise your hand and put them forward. We have one person here and one, okay, we have several. Let's go with Leon here first.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you for a very interesting conference today. I work with UN Watch, which is an NGO based in Geneva, where we try to expose the inequities of the Human Rights Council and also give voice to the human rights victims. I just want to comment on what our discussion with Rosa about the role of the EU, which was also brought up by Paula. First, it's and why I think the EU is crucial in improving the Human Rights Council, the function of the Human Rights Council. Number one, it often lacks principle, the EU. For example, at the elections to the Human Rights Council, more than half of the countries of the European Union voted for China, which is a sad fact, meaning if we want the EU to advance human rights, they have to talk the walk and walk the talk, as they say. Number two, on the introspection, in Geneva, there are 150 meetings every year to coordinate among the EU countries. 150, that means one meeting every 2 days, including the weekends and the holidays and the summer holidays, which is a lot of time spending just coordinating among themselves. And the third, I just want to use An example to have some proposals is the example is of the Durban Review Conference, which was the follow-up of the Durban Conference, the UN Conference Against Racism in 2009, when 10 countries did not participate, including 5 European Union countries, which is the first time ever that 5 EU countries boycotted a UN conference, and many others had credible threats to walk out had certain lines, red lines, been crossed out. And I think that's a very good precedent, which actually worked because the conference was did not cross any big lines, and was actually, it went okay. The difference between the UN and the non-aligned movement is the participation of the European Union. And I think the European Union has to trade hard its participation to safeguard the United Nations being successful. They shouldn't take the participation for granted. They should have credible threats of not participating in case the UN is transgressing. And also they have to bring the UN back at home. Currently, I think only the US Congress is debating the Human Rights Council. I would like to see every country in Europe debate. We are taxpayers, we're paying our money to our governments. Our governments are paying their dues to the UN. How much effective is this? We as citizens, as parliaments, we have the right to know how effective our money is. So let's bring the Human Rights Council at home, and let's debate it at home, and that will give power to our diplomats when they negotiate at the UN to say, I have the parliament back home what's very interested in what's happening in Geneva. So I cannot really sign up at everything you tell me because I'll get in trouble back home. The moment this is not there, then I think that the diplomats don't have this democratic control. And I think that's a reason why the EU is not so effective. Sorry for taking so much time.
It's okay. We actually have a representative still from the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I don't know if, is it unfair to, but...
Is it on? Yeah. My name is Mette Dissing. I'm the head of department for the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs Human Rights Department. I didn't ask for the floor talking about how the EU interacts in human rights frameworks. I don't think many EU countries would disagree with the assessment. It always looks different from the inside. Having 28 countries agreeing on topics that we actually do disagree on internally is not an easy task. Is it well spent time to spend 150 meetings with each other? Maybe not. I think there's no reason not to be honest about this, and I think it would be fair to say that it's probably not good for the Human Rights Council. Neither is it good for the European External Action Service that we've tried to establish at the very same time as the Human Rights Council was established. So you're still having an EU trying to find its own feet in establishing a credible foreign policy together. And then this is just completely by coincidence coinciding with the establishment of this new human rights body. So it is difficult for the EU to act. And I think we are getting better at it, but there is lots of room for improvement, and we are not sure what is the best way. We're always caught in between having sort of a strong European voice, i.e. 28 countries together, on the one side, or in breaking out and trying to establish other cross-regional coalitions. Both have their upsides, and both of them are not sort of the best way around. So we haven't found a good way yet. And if there could come anything out of this meeting or other meetings that you could sort of help us with, we're always receptive of good recommendations, but it is a challenge. And I don't think anybody within the European Union would feel, you know, that's basically just a statement that we would agree to most of the time.
Thank you very much for speaking out on that. There were several other people who had
hello, my name is Ezgi. I'm a visiting researcher at ICART. I have a clarification question for Guillermo, actually. You referred to the extraterritorial application of the human rights law, and you sort of criticized it. And I was wondering then, what's the alternative? Because then those countries who cherish human rights at home can do whatever abroad, and what is the protection mechanism then? And also I was wondering, because in the room you talked about freedom of expression and the dissidents, but then I kept thinking that's very paradoxical today, is that we need a it takes a Putin to save Snowden as well. I mean, there's that too. And what do you guys think about it?
Would you go first? Yeah, I thought you were taking a few questions. Now, extraterritoriality is a very difficult one. There are, I mean, if you compare, for example, the US position in constitutional law with where we are with the ECHR, there is quite a difference. First of all, it isn't clear where we are with the ECHR because the case law goes in all sorts of different directions. One of the risks of saying that human rights apply while you're abroad in an armed conflict is that, again, you risk diluting this idea of human rights so that it can be relevant to the circumstances of war. And I think it is dangerous. And again, I think it is one of the areas where actually the ideas end up generating bad practice. Because Grotius, in his great wisdom, decided that we should keep war and peace separate when he came to setting out the rules. Also because he wanted to preserve peace from war in terms of regulation. We don't want in times of peace to be governed by the same rules that apply in times of war. So having, this extraterritorial application of human rights in armed conflict has really undermined that distinction between war and peace, which is foundational in a practical sense, in a moral sense, in a political sense, and that is my main criticism. Now, I also agree that there should be certain very narrow circumstances in which state obligations should be respected also extraterritorially, but I think we may have gone too far.
Krista, you had some comments on Snowden.
Just a quick one. I'm also certain that Snowden is worthy of rescue, as it were. I mean, we have to recall that Putin is doing this not out of the greatness of his heart, but to spiting the West, as it were, score points at home. We should recall that freedom of expression is indeed not unlimited, and national security is a legitimate concern when it comes to limiting freedom of expression. So whether a whistleblower is actually worthy of protection under human rights depends on to what extent the government is using national security in a legitimate way or as a subterfuge or a ploy to stifle freedom of expression. And it's impossible for anyone here to sit and say that the US government is in the wrong in pursuing extradition from Russia of Snowden and charging him. We'll see what would happen on that one. Let me just say that I think it's sad that the NSA debacle, which follows from the Guantanamo debacle, has made that the US, who I think should be considered to be the paragon when it comes to upholding the rule of law. I mean, I know of no system which is better in self-reckoning itself when it's treading down the wrong road. But I think the combination of these factors, the war on terror, which everything that's entailed, including now the NSA, and the fact that the US now seems to take a step back in involvement in international affairs, is doing the whole area of human rights a disservice, and I wish things were different in that respect.
Okay.
So just a couple of things on that. One, Snowden had the ability as a whistleblower to use plenty of legal mechanisms within the U.S. to raise the concerns that he wanted to raise. There are reasons that governments have secret information. All of them do. There's reasons why documents are classified. You can say, is it overly done? You can have that debate. But there is a legitimate reason to have classified documents. You don't have to release tens of thousands of classified documents and flee justice and flee the country, which, by the way, is an illegal act, right? Media can publish these, and they have different protections than a government employee or contractor who has signed a legal obligation not to expose classified information. So there were options open that could, I think, have opened that debate. And again, I think the U.S. is one of the best in having self-reflective and self-correction measures. So putting Snowden aside, there was, not surprisingly, a real genuine process in the United States that started to look at its policies. I think that coming out of, there was two separate processes. There's presidential review committee, outside experts that came in, put together this report. Then there was an internal review group, both of which presented their recommendations. The president then came out and made this speech and announced that the U.S. would be making policy changes to respond to some of those concerns that were raised. That's exactly how you want a country to respond. On the extraterritoriality issue, if you look at, putting aside the law of war, looking at human rights law, and looking at the ICCPR, for instance, the ICCPR is very clear. If you read Article 2 of the ICCPR, states have the obligation to ensure the rights of individuals within their borders and within their jurisdictions. Then you have Article 4, which highlights some rights that have to be respected everywhere regardless. And so it lists those articles. These are right to life, right to your freedom of belief, freedom from torture. Those are rights that are non-derogatable. But the whole rest of the ICCPR, states are not subject to obligations legally. It doesn't mean, however, that they can't have policies that extend protections to people abroad. And I think that that's what you're seeing in the conversation that's now taking place on the privacy issues. Okay, we don't think we violated any laws here, either our domestic laws or international law, but we hear you that this is a concern, and so we're going to implement policies that make people feel more comfortable. And I think that's exactly what you want governments to do.
All right. The gentleman in the tie and the shirt. Yeah.
In the tie. Thank you. My name is Stephen Freeland. I'm a professor in Australia and also at I-Courts here. I feel like I'm the devil incarnate today because, one, I'm a professor. Two, I work with judges who have also got a bad rap here. Three, I come from Australia, which was criticised earlier, although I agree with the criticisms. And to make matters worse, I used to be an investment banker. So all of that means I'm probably not the person you want to hear from. But I do most of my work in the sphere of international criminal law, which I always describe to people as the flip side of human rights. And I came here, and I must admit I've been amazed by some of the discussion I've heard today, because the trend in international criminal law, which I think is a good thing, is that there's been an expansion of norms. Interpretations by judges or whoever that have broadened the scope of these things that are there to, set standards of behaviour. A theme today was many of you pleaded for the idea that, hey, we've gone crazy with calling everything a human right. Any social issue is a human right problem. Climate change is a human right problem. The global financial crisis is a human rights. Part of the theme, as I understood it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is let's narrow our focus again to the really crunch issues of torture and right to life, etc., etc. I just wonder whether, that's totally surprising to me. I just wonder whether that really is an approach. If we would have had this panel in another part of the world, would we have got the same conclusion? Is that I'm sure you'll disagree with me, but is that the right approach in terms of the making people aware that Emily was talking this morning? And if I teach my students in Australia or in the United States or Denmark and I talk about human rights and I just say, well, human rights is not about torture and it's not about killing people and it's about a fair trial, they'll look at me and go, yeah, that's great, thanks, Professor, but it won't really sink into them because it's not part of, especially in my country, Australia, where we're in Ireland, it's not part of the psyche because it's not relevant, really. You can't really imagine it. And I just think my own personal view is the way that we move forward in a human rights discourse, whatever that may mean, is making people, it's a way of thinking. And if the way of thinking means you say that climate change affects human rights, well, so be it. I don't think that's a dangerous thing. I think we have to change the culture because all of you are admitting in your own ways that the system, with all the successes, the system is not working as it should and as it could. But let's go back to the fundamentals. And I just think perhaps another way of looking at it, maybe that is naive and maybe I'm an optimist or a pessimist, I'm not sure. But I was just very surprised with the theme today. Thank you very much.
let's have another question straight away. Yeah, there with the...
Excuse me. Hi, my name is Laurits Kitcher. I'm soon to be graduate at Copenhagen University Faculty of Law and Masters. I would like to address the issue of legitimacy of the UN, which we have already touched upon a bit. We touched firstly upon governments not respecting human rights, which is one area of legitimacy, but we also talked about public legitimacy, which I believe Paula talked about, like the issue of the public and can they trust these rights. And I think that there is a very important place to look within the UN system itself, because in order for something to be legitimate, it has to be perceived as effective. And there is a problem there within the UN itself, because at the Universal Periodic Review, at the side events, many people will go there and they will represent and they will speak up against their governments and tell of their torture victims and so on, and afterwards they will go back home and they will be tortured for speaking at the UN conventions, at the UN Human Rights Council, and I've been there and I've seen in person how they send agents to take pictures in secret of these people who does that. And I think this tremendously hurts the legitimacy of the UN system and the public belief in that these rights can ever be enforced and that they have any chance against these oppressive governments. So my question is, what should we do to protect these people more who stand out there at these meetings? Thank you.
Okay, so we have two questions. Would any of the panelists like to, the first question about, which was basically, as I understood it, a surprise at the criticism level about what we could broadly call proliferation, perhaps, inflation of rights. And Guillermo, would you like to address that?
Yes. Now, I don't think, and I don't think anyone on the panel, or the people can speak for themselves, thinks that health, education, climate change, or peace are unimportant aims. The question is whether it is appropriate to give them this particular form of a legal right and an international legal right, and that's where I'm not so sure. There are some constitutions, the Irish one and the Indian one, that, for example, had a number of directives of state policy in the constitution, which were, all the worthy social goals that state policy should be directed towards promoting, like, better health for the people, better education, etc., etc. But it did not protect them as rights. So I think all of these things, or some of them, not perhaps all of them, but most of them do deserve to be in a constitutional text and in an international treaty. But the question is, should they be protected through this form of a human right, i.e. something that is justiciable, that you act upon, take to a judge, and a judge is well equipped to decide. That to me is the test, not that they're unimportant.
And if I was to follow up, for instance, if we're serious about saying that you have that the climate change is a human, what would be the implications? So next time there's a flood on a Pacific island that affects someone, first of all, you'd have to say, well, was that related to climate change, or was it a natural disaster that would have occurred anyways? And next, I mean, then if you live on a Pacific island that doesn't have a big, huge carbon footprint, then likely it's not your own government that would have been responsible. So where do you take your claim to? I mean, how do you identify which state would be responsible? Could you take your claim to the US, or would it most likely be China? I just don't see how that could function at all. And I would say that there's plenty of attention to the issue of climate change, and there are different forums, experts, and I think it's probably better to have scientists who know about this determine these things rather than deciding the proper course of climate change in the Human Rights Council. I don't think that would be a wise direction to head down. we have more panelists on this also. Oh, sorry.
I think also you have to see it not just as justiciability and the ability to go to court, but also human rights are not zero-sum. There's not infinite resources in terms of time, expertise, and money. And if we have bodies that deal with politics, or economics, or climate change, or anything else, and they are not responding appropriately, we can't just say, let's shove these things into the human rights bodies, because actually, however badly they are operating at times, they operate better than the climate change ones, right? They do more than the climate change ones or the economics ones at times. So we can't just say, okay, let's shove them into the human rights matrix because those bodies are failing. Get those bodies strengthened. Get the Kyoto principles or whatever else goes on with the scientists. Get this stuff worked out in the appropriate forum, thus leaving resources that are directed to human rights for human rights. So it's not as simple, I think, as your idea, which is quite nice. You know, let's just bring everything in and change our culture, change our way of thinking about it. This has big practical impact on the ground in terms of the fundamental rights.
All right, I think we have to jump to the next question because we're almost out of time. So does someone like to respond to the thing? Chris?
Well, before I do that, I just will say that we're all victims of our experiences, obviously. And I'm obviously still an optimistic realist. But when I see how, under the cover of treaty body strengthening, and Paula touched upon this, which is happening as we speak, when Russia, China, Belarus, Pakistan, and some other countries have hijacked the process and saying, we will do this system better. And their intent is to actually smash it to pieces. And the Western countries are assisting because we're all feeling the economic crunch. Allocation isn't there where it used to be. So the combination of, if you will, the evil forces and the somewhat forced complacency of liberal Democrats is actually running the risk of crushing the whole treaty body system. And that's why I think it's so important to try to focus it on the most important parts. Secondly, on the defense of civil rights defenders and others, if I understood the question correctly, that has been addressed in the instrument which I proudly presented before, General Comment 34. So if you have the time to retrieve that and go to paragraphs 45 and 46, you will see that we are very much aware of that, and we have lumped it under the freedom of expression notion, saying not even if there is a state of emergency should a state actually stop a journalist or any other human rights investigator to actually access that part and do their job in trying to explore abuse and violations of human rights. So paragraphs 45 and 46 of General Comment 34. Thank you.
Paula, and then I think we owe this gentleman an answer to, you had a question before about sanctions, and that will be the last before we end this conference.
So this issue you raise on reprisals, essentially against civil society for actually cooperating with the UN system is a huge, huge problem within the system. It's one of the reasons that the U.S. established through this resolution, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Association and Peaceful Assembly. Of course, there was already a Special Rapporteur on the protection of human rights defenders, which also addresses this issue. But the broader civil society and folks who engage with the UN system expand beyond individuals who simply identify themselves as human rights defenders, although many of them are. It's another area where we have got to do better, frankly. We have mixed success. So we'll pass an excellent resolution at the Human Rights Council Hungary, led with a large number of co-sponsors, including members of the Africa group and really cross-regional group on this issue of reprisals, talking about the fact that states cannot go and harass and beat up and sanction in any way individuals who either come to Geneva to provide testimony at a side event or to pull aside a state government and say, hey, this is what's really happening in our country, or who submit a report for the Universal Periodic Review process. I can tell you at Freedom House, we had a number of organizations who would say to us, can you write a report for us because we can't put our names on it? And initially, the stakeholders had to indicate who they are. They said we're being threatened by the governments that if we dare submit a report, bad things will happen to our families. So it's through the UPR process. It's for providing testimony to these independent experts and special rapporteurs and commissions of inquiry. So there's this great resolution passed with Human Rights Council. Everybody's feeling good, big victory. Then you go to the General Assembly. You have all these different dynamics coming into play, including the ruling on the ICC against Kenya that it was very upset about. What ended up happening is the Africa Group ran a resolution that they usually run that sort of accepts the report of the Human Rights Council at the General Assembly. We tend to not like it because we don't like everything that happens at the Human Rights Council and we don't want to welcome everything. But anyway, putting that aside, we usually join consensus on it. It's relatively harmless. This year, the Africa Group inserted language specifically regarding this reprisals resolution, basically saying this resolution needs to be renegotiated here at the General Assembly because the Human Rights Council stepped outside its bounds. It's exceeded its mandate in setting up a UN focal point within the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to specifically document information on reprisals against individuals for cooperating with the UN system. The pretext was, it's just a procedural issue, right? The HRC didn't have the mandate to set this up. Our response was, the HRC has the mandate to cover everything human rights focused. This is fundamentally a human rights issue. Of course it has the mandate to do that. They didn't, of course, want to say, oh, it's because we really want to engage in harassing and beating up on people who provide information, although certainly members of certain countries who voted for it absolutely feel that way. But they did it on this sneaky sort of procedural grounds. And so, you know, we lost the vote. We lost the vote by 2 in the third committee, and we lost the vote by 3 in the plenary session. And it still remains to be seen how we're going to deal with this now at the General Assembly. Does it mean that everything that we managed to get done at the HRC, some countries don't like it, and then they're going to pull back, rally their forces, and then try to renegotiate at another body? Terrible precedent. Terrible not only because of the precedent about calling into question what the HRC does, terrible because it was on this one specific resolution that should be such a no-brainer, right? Who would not say that there shouldn't be, you know, protection for these individuals? So we've got these mechanisms, we've got the special rapporteurs, the United States, the UK, other countries consistently speak out and defend the right of individuals to speak up during the council sessions. They are interrupted and harassed constantly with points of order. We will always, as a matter of course, speak up for them. It doesn't matter what they're saying, it doesn't matter if they're criticizing us, it doesn't matter if we think they're absolutely crazy, we will defend their right to speak up. But we need to think about more, and it's a real problem, and we need to think of creative ways to provide better protection for these individuals. So I'm open to brainstorming on this.
I think we should ask, do we have someone who would address the question of sanctions very briefly before we finish?
The sanction question.
Do sanctions work?
I can't. Yeah. Aye. Because of the way the Human Rights Council is set up, and in fact the whole way that the UN is set up, because of the way the UN is set up, the only body that has the power to issue sanctions or enforcement powers is the Security Council. And there has been a movement towards pushing some human rights situations to the Security Council because they threaten international peace and security. So we saw quite a lot of this throughout the 90s. And it's, you know, even doing things like sanctions or enforcing a no-fly zone may help where you've got a grave crisis situation that threatens international peace and security. The problem is, if you were to issue sanctions against every country that is violating human rights, even systematically violating human rights, you'd have more countries that are being sanctioned than countries able to sanction them. And so I think it's not a case of would they work. Yes, coercive measures would work, but I don't think it's practical to use them for every even if you use them at every country that currently systematically abuses the rights of LGBT persons. So a hell of a lot of countries to be issuing sanctions against. They could set up their own trade agreements between them. So I think the only way of doing it is the way it currently occurs at the Security Council. But I think that there could be other linkages, things like, I know I keep harping on about it, I'm hoping that anyone in the room that's got the power to do this will do it. Things like stopping aid to those countries that we see are not fulfilling their human rights commitments, right? Or saying to those countries, instead of putting sanctions on them about, trade, saying to them, actually, we will give you positive encouragement to implement human rights by saying we will, rather than taking things away from you, we will enhance our relations with you if we see that you're taking steps in the right direction. Hope that answers your question. Pardon? South Africa. Yeah.
Okay, I don't think that we can ask you to stay in the room anymore. Several have already quietly left, but I want to thank the speakers for joining us here today. It has been a real pleasure. I want to thank those of you who still remain here, who have been with us since 9 a.m. I know it's been a really long day with a lot of challenging arguments. So thank you very much, and thank you for joining our conference. And please go to our website, the Freedom Rights Project website, and read our reports and engage with us and work with us in securing a higher degree of respect for fundamental freedoms. Thank you very much.